I was drugged and left for dead in the Australian outback, but I survived an astonishing 71 days in the desert. This is me before and this is me after this nightmare. The nightmare unfolded in January 2006 as I was driving from Queensland to Port Hedland. I encountered a hitchhiker along the way and offered him a ride. We struck up a conversation, during which he offered me a drink. Unwisely, I accepted. My next memory is of awakening in a shallow grave, buried under layers of dirt and sand. I managed to claw my way out, but I was in a state of shock. My location was unknown to me, as was the length of time I'd been there. My car and all my belongings had vanished. All I had were the clothes on my back and a knife I habitually carried. I was surrounded by an endless desert, one of the harshest and driest places on Earth, with temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and dropping below freezing at night. I began walking, hoping to find help. For weeks I wandered the wilderness alone, grappling with hunger, thirst, extreme temperatures, venomous creatures, and wild animals. I built shelters from branches and leaves, dug holes to collect rainwater, and ate whatever I could find, including lizards, snakes, insects, and plants. I lost a significant amount of weight. My skin was sunburnt and blistered, my hair and beard grew unkempt, and my clothes were reduced to rags. Despite the odds, I clung to hope, continually reassuring myself that I would be found. And indeed I was. After enduring 71 days of hell, I came across a cattle station where workers found me. They rushed me to Darwin for medical treatment. The doctors were astounded by my survival, attributing it to my body's remarkable adaptation to the harsh conditions. In the aftermath of this harrowing experience, I decided to share my story with the world. I penned a book detailing my survival, hoping that my tale of resilience and hope in the face of adversity would inspire others. Thank you for tuning in.
This woman's kidnapping story was so bizarre, many, including police, thought it was a hoax. This is the case of Denise Huskins. In 2015 in Vallejo, California, Denise and Aaron Quinn began dating. They both worked as physical therapists and were a cute couple, according to friends. But they had been having some issues, as Denise found out that Aaron had been cheating with an ex. The two were having a hard time, but trying to work it out. On March 22nd at 3 a.m., the couple was upstairs sleeping at home when they woke up to find an intruder had broken in and was in their bedroom in a wetsuit. The intruder then tells Aaron to give him his computer and bank account information. He then forced the couple to put on swimming goggles that had been covered in duct tape and put headphones on. The intruder was also reportedly telling them how good they were doing throughout the entire ordeal. He gave them both a sedative, took Denise, and told Aaron he'd contact him via text with ransom demands. The next day, Aaron woke up from the sedative. The intruder told him not to call police, so Aaron fell back asleep, but later in the day made the call. Aaron tells police what happened, but to them, the story sounds far-fetched. Aaron's cheating and the couple's recent relationship issues made police suspicious of him. A massive manhunt ensued. 140 police and FBI searched all over for Denise. When suddenly, 48 hours later, Denise reappears, seemingly unharmed in Huntington Beach, California, 400 miles away from where she was taken. She said her captor had released her in her hometown on the street she grew up on. Denise told police a similar story to what Aaron had told them and said she was taken by a man to his home in Lake Tahoe where horrible things happened. Then said he just decided to release her, drove her all the way to Huntington Beach, dropped her off near her dad's home, and then drove away. Twists and turns, but police weren't buying any of it. The story was so elaborate it almost seemed like the plot of a thriller movie. Many began comparing Denise's story to the plot of Gone Girl. Boyfriend or husband is caught cheating, girl leaves, and then pins it on the spouse. Police said they felt they had wasted resources and declared the whole thing a hoax. Both Aaron and Denise hired attorneys. But a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle started receiving anonymous messages from someone claiming responsibility for the crime. 2 months later, police got reports of another home invasion near San Francisco, another couple, and the stories were eerily similar. The intruder ran away but left his cell phone at the scene. They tracked that phone to this man. Matthew Mueller, a 38-year-old Harvard-trained attorney and ex-Marine. His property is searched, and what do they find in his possession? Aaron's stolen laptop. Go to part 2. This is the case of Denise Huskins, part 2. After another home invasion similar to Denise and Aaron's, the suspect, Matthew Mueller, was found, searched, and taken into custody. They find Aaron's stolen computer in Mueller's possession and immediately start putting two and two together. Denise and Aaron did not make up this entire thing. The man who was guilty had been caught. Strangely, Mueller had used a remote-controlled drone to spy on Denise and Aaron before the entire ordeal. He eventually confessed and was sentenced to 40 years behind bars and was just sentenced to another 31 years. Denise and Aaron were vindicated and won a settlement of $2.5 million from the Vallejo police, but say the whole thing and what they went through was traumatizing. The two are now married with a child. I can't imagine. This is one of the craziest cases I've ever heard of. What are your thoughts?
This is like really big news here in Arizona. Oh my god. She like went to my old high school and I think she went missing her freshman year. But I'm like in shock right now. I'm really curious to see what unfolds out of this.
Picture this. It's the summer of 1975 and 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington has left her Pennsylvania home to walk to Bible camp. Somewhere along her 10-minute route, she vanishes. 2 months later, her skeletal remains were found in a state park 7 miles from her home. Despite police efforts, the case goes cold, and it stays that way for nearly 50 years, until now. This is 83-year-old David Zanstra. He was just charged with Gretchen's murder. But who is he? Did he even know her? The answer is yes. David Zanstra was a pastor who worked at the Bible camp the girl was headed to that day. Let's start from the beginning. On August 5th, 1975, Gretchen Harrington left her Marple Township home to go to Bible camp, just a short walk away. According to the Delaware County DA, the camp was held at 2 locations that day, a church where her father was a pastor and a church where Zanstra was a pastor. She disappeared along the walk to her father's church. According to Medium, cops responded quickly due to her age. Within hours, Marple Township police had gathered hundreds of volunteers to search the area. They also set up a 24-hour tip hotline. From the start, Gretchen's parents, the Reverend Harold Harrington and Ina Harrington, maintained that their daughter wouldn't have gotten into a vehicle with a stranger. On October 14th, 1975, a jogger spotted skeletal remains at Ridley Creek State Park. They belonged to Gretchen. Her death was ruled a homicide. According to court documents, a medical examiner said she suffered 2 or more blunt impacts to the skull. Because the body was found in a state park, Pennsylvania State Police joined the investigation. They believed she was killed in the same spot she was found. Though officials couldn't determine whether Gretchen had been sexually assaulted, investigators believed it was a possibility. The killer had removed her clothing and her underwear had been placed on a tree branch. Per the Delaware County DA, law enforcement officials spent the days following interviewing locals and registered sex offenders in the area. There was reportedly a person of interest, but police had no real evidence. One witness did report seeing Gretchen talking to an unidentified man in either a 2-tone Cadillac or a green station wagon. We now know that Zanstra was interviewed by police the month that Gretchen's body was found, and get this, according to a newly released criminal complaint, investigators were suspicious of him from the jump, reportedly noticing inaccuracies in his statements. Plus, he somehow knew what Gretchen was wearing that day despite the fact that she never arrived at camp. Still, the case went cold. Now flash forward to this year. On January 2nd, 2023, investigators interviewed an individual who was reportedly best friends with Zanstra's daughter, per the Delaware County DA. The person said they awoke to Zanstra groping them during a sleepover. They claimed they told his daughter, who said that the then pastor did that sometimes. The informant also showed police a diary entry the individual wrote in 1975, the year Gretchen was killed. According to the criminal complaint, she wrote, "Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It's a secret, so I can't tell anyone, but I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z." Investigators then confronted Zanstra with the evidence. According to the Delaware County DA, he admitted to everything. He told officials that, as noted in witness reports from that day, he had been driving a green station wagon when he saw Gretchen walking to camp. He offered her a ride but drove to a wooded area nearby instead of the church. The former pastor said he then told Gretchen to remove her clothes, but she refused. After that, Zanstra said he struck her in the head with a fist. Thinking she was dead, he tried to cover up her body and left. On July 17, 2023, Zanstra was arrested in Cobb County, Georgia, and charged with murder in the first, first, second, and third degree, criminal homicide, possession of an instrument of crime, and the kidnapping of a minor. Investigators are now in the process of testing Xantra's DNA against evidence found in other cold cases and not just in Pennsylvania. DNA comparisons will also be made in Georgia and Texas, 2 states in which Xantra previously lived.
It's time for Cookies and Crime. This is the case of the Ken and Barbie killers. Paul Bernardo was an intelligent and popular 23-year-old from the Scarborough area of Toronto, Canada. Meanwhile, Karla Homolka was a 17-year-old living in Chateauguay. She was the oldest of 3 girls, worked part-time at an animal hospital, volunteering and maintaining good grades. The two met at a restaurant and immediately hit it off. Bernardo started sharing his twisted fantasies with Homolka. She not only allowed him to indulge in his sick obsessions, but also encouraged him. As the relationship went on, Bernardo teased Homolka about being used goods, since he wasn't her first physical relationship. Because she didn't want to lose him to someone more innocent, she offered her little sister's virginity. In December 1990, the couple planned to get 14-year-old Tammy Homolka so drunk that she wouldn't realize what was happening to her. When that didn't work, the couple slipped a Valium into the young teen's drink. Then, they violated her. Tammy began violently throwing up and choking. The couple called 911 in a panic and they scrambled to cover their tracks. Tammy ended up dying from choking on her own vomit. Nothing was suspected and it was ruled an accident. In the early morning of June 15, 1991, Bernardo drove around Burlington to steal license plates. He found 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey standing outside her home. She had missed her curfew after attending a friend's wake and was locked out of her house. Bernardo went up to Mahaffey, saying that he wanted to break into a neighbor's house. Unfazed, she asked if he had any cigarettes. He said he had some in his car, and when they went, he blindfolded her and forced her into the car. Then the couple tortured and SA'd her as well. Because her blindfold had slipped from her face, the couple believed that she might be able to identify them if they let her live. She was murdered, had her body taken apart, and her body parts were encased in concrete bricks. Their last victim would be Kristen French. 15-year-old French was walking home from school. The couple pulled into a parking lot next to her and pretended to need assistance with directions. That's when Bernardo attacked her from behind and brandished a knife, forcing her into the car. When she didn't come home, her parents notified the police. She would also be murdered, and the couple had Easter dinner right after. Bernardo was eventually arrested after his DNA matched. Homolka was questioned after. Later that night, Homolka told her aunt and uncle that Bernardo was the one they were looking for, and that she and Bernardo were involved in the murder of Mahaffey and French, and that the SA they did to the girls were recorded on videotape. This information reopened the investigation of Tammy Homolka's death. Homolka entered a plea bargain, which meant she was only sentenced to 12 years in prison. Bernardo was sentenced to life in prison and was declared a dangerous offender in 1995. When a psychopathy checklist was done, Homolka scored 5 out of 40, but Bernardo scored 35 out of 40. After prison, Homolka settled in Quebec and volunteers at a local elementary school.
Pay attention to the girl looking straight into the camera. To most people, Annette Craver looks like a regular teenage girl, but something isn't quite right. Her mother, Mary Rose, noticed that her daughter wasn't the same since she returned from a recent trip to California. What she doesn't know is that, while over there, her innocent daughter tied the knot with a serial killer. In 1983, 43-year-old Felix Vale, a cult leader, manipulator, and serial killer, married 17-year-old Annette Craver, putting her entire being under his control.
There was nothing in her eyes. There was no personality there. It was like a zombie.
But the teenager still had enough sense in her to try to overcome her tyrannical husband.
She said, "I'm leaving, Felix. I want a divorce. I'm going back to school."
But this was too little too late, because Annette disappeared shortly after, leaving no clues behind. Frustrated by the local police's lack of action, Mary Rose, Annette's mother, launched her own investigation, but no one expected how far she was ready to go to find her daughter and stop her son-in-law's killing spree.
And she threw out a machete, and I'm like, what in the world have I gotten myself into?
You didn't worry about the risks. I don't worry about the risk. I just wanted to know the truth.
September 8th, 1981. It was the end of the summer in Houston, Texas. 15-year-old Annette and her mother Mary were having a yard sale to sell off the last remaining items belonging to Annette's late father, who died in a car crash 2 years prior. Unbeknownst to Mary, her daughter was still struggling with the loss of her father.
This is your friend Annette, and here is your long-awaited tape. Hope you like it.
spent a lot of time alone. She was always writing poetry and drawing, picked up the guitar.
This kind of solitude and isolation concerned Mary.
Annette, I'm sure, missed her dad more than I realized. I even asked her one time if she thought she needed to see someone to talk, and she said, "No, Mom, I'm fine."
But the truth was that, behind her mother's back, Annette made a new friend, a charming, yet much older man she met in the city. At 40 years old, Felix Vale was even older than Mary herself, so when he showed up at the yard sale, talking it up to her daughter, she didn't think of him as a potential threat.
I think I may have seen him on his motorcycle. He was just another customer.
Mary was very preoccupied at the time. Since the death of Annette's father, she simply couldn't find any work in Houston. She needed to move away to be able to provide for her daughter, but lacked the money to do so, until an opportunity arose in the neighboring state in Oklahoma. The only issue was that Annette, who had already skipped 2 grades, was about to graduate from high school, and Mary knew that moving away could compromise her progress. So she decided to leave her in the care of a friend for a few months while she temporarily left for work, a decision she'd later come to regret when she learned that the mysterious stranger she met at the yard sale was getting closer and closer to her underage daughter.
She did mention in letters that Felix stopped by, but I didn't know that there was intimacy. And then I learned that Felix made many, many visits. I regret that I left, and she even said to me in a letter, "I feel like you abandoned me."
With Mary away, Felix easily manipulated Annette and convinced her to go on a road trip with him after her graduation. Meanwhile, Mary saved money for months and was eager to announce to her daughter that she bought a house for them under both of their names. Finally, they would be able to live together again. When she learned that Annette already left, Mary was devastated.
Oh my gosh, why didn't I do this differently? All the decisions I made that I would do differently now.
For an entire year, she tried to get in touch with her daughter. She eventually got a few letters, but never from the same place, until the day she received a dreaded call from Annette asking for her approval to marry Felix in California.
I said, "Why don't you wait till you turn 18? This is a big mistake." She said, "I love you, Mom, and we'll go to Mexico and get married."
Fearing that saying no would push her daughter away, Mary had to make a choice, another difficult decision that still haunts her to this day.
I don't want to estrange her from me. And I trusted her, and I didn't know he was a bad guy. So I fell for it.
Through her letters, Annette explained to her mother that Felix changed after the wedding. He suddenly became very controlling and even forced her to undergo an illegal abortion after she became pregnant with his child. In shock, her mother tried to convince her to come back, and eventually, Annette found the courage within herself to break free from Felix's grasp and return to Mary Rose.
But she was not herself. She was so confused. When we were painting the downstairs and she looked into the camera with this intense look on her face, like, "What do you want from me?" I think she was just overwhelmed with the way he had tried to control her and mess with her mind.
Even if she wasn't the same anymore, Mary was happy to finally be reunited with her daughter. But their respite was short-lived. Felix started calling the house over and over, demanding to talk to Annette. Mary didn't flinch and tried her best to protect her, but one day, mere weeks after their reunion, Felix came to their home, walked in without asking, and directly went to see Annette.
He spent some time with her alone, and then they approached me and said, "We want you out of the house."
Mary tried as best she could to resolve this with Annette, but Felix's grasp on her was overwhelming. Forced to leave her daughter behind a second time, Mary Rose renounced her half of the house, packed her bags, and moved to California. Soon after, Annette turned 18 and cashed in the inheritance left by her late father. She then allegedly proceeded to move all of her money into Felix's accounts and deeded her house to his name. Upon learning of this, Mary immediately called Felix.
And what he told me was that he had put her on a bus and that she was going to Mexico. I hung up and called the police and filed a missing persons report.
Without any evidence or anything to look into, the police went to Felix. But unfortunately for Mary, he put them under the same kind of spell that charmed her daughter 3 years prior.
They believed Felix. He convinced them that she had left on her own. After I wrote to the DA, they didn't respond, so...
Since the authorities refused to look into her disappearance, Mary hung on to the only thing she had left, hope.
Yes, I wanted to believe she was alive. I waited and waited. I sat by the phone, and I kept waiting for a call. Christmas, her birthday, my birthday, Mother's Day. I would stay close to a phone on those days in those early years, thinking this is it. This is the day she's going to say, "Hi, Mom."
But doubt sowed into her mind as the years went by.
I said, all right, if she's trying to get away from her mother, why isn't anybody else hearing from her? She had family.
After 7 years and hundreds of unanswered letters to the police, the FBI, and even to Felix himself, Mary had enough. She accumulated small pieces of information on Felix's family over the years, but this was the early days of the internet, and the data was scarce to say the least. However, there was no way she would be waiting for the police to take action any longer, so she decided to start her own investigation. She began with the only strong lead she had found, Sue Jordan, Felix's sister, and drove halfway around the country to meet with her.
She told me that Felix had a wife who had drowned.
Shocked by this revelation, Mary tracked the family of Felix's first wife, Mary Horton Vale. She quickly located Will Horton, Mary's little brother, who was only 15 when she drowned in the Calcasieu River.
A lady calls me and says, "You don't know me, but Felix Vale married my daughter, and she's missing." And I said, "Oh my God." My sister was so very special, so thoughtful, kind.
Mary Rose couldn't help but feel for Will Horton, who only had good things to say about his sister.
Okay, the verdict seems to be in order, and I will read it as follows. Question 1. At the time the crimes were committed, did the defendant have a mental disease or mental defect? Answer, no. There's no answer then for question 2. It is dated this date, July 27, 2023, signed by the foreperson. There were no dissenting jurors.
This is Gary Glitter, one of the worst pedophiles in world history. And this guy was a rock star. The story is extremely disturbing. So all of the bad things that Gary Glitter had done in the past resurfaced in 2019 when The Joker came out. His song was the one that was used during this infamous dancing stairway scene. But let's rewind. Paul Francis Gadd was born in 1944 in England. It was in the year 1971 during the glam rock movement when Paul began to use the stage name Gary Glitter and his career really took off. The release of his album titled Glitter was a massive success. The song Rock and Roll reached high points on all charts across the world, and he seemed to be this, new age progressive rock and roll star. And for years, Gary was heralded as a rock and roll icon. This guy was loved by thousands, millions of people across the planet. But that would all change in the year 1997 when Gary took his computer into a repair shop in England. The technician at the time that was taking a look at Gary's laptop discovered CP images on his hard drive. The police then got involved. They searched his home and found even more CP. This guy was sick. After all was said and done, it was discovered that Gary had downloaded over 4,000 images of CP onto his computer. He had also had a relationship with a 14-year-old girl in the 1970s, and he was given a 4-month prison sentence. After he was released from prison, Gary felt the heat from the public now hating him in England, so he fled to another country. But after the authorities in Cambodia discovered who he was exposed, and he was then deported to Bangkok. He eventually settled, though, in Vietnam. And it was in Vietnam where Gary resumed his typical pedo behaviors. He was banned from a nightclub for groping a teenage waitress. Other people saw him bringing 2 young girls into his home. And on November 12, 2005, Gary fled his home in Vietnam. Authorities eventually searched the place and found a 15-year-old girl that was living with him. He then tried to escape the country, but he was arrested at the airport. And from that point on, multiple Vietnamese girls came forward that were underage and said that Gary Glitter had, assaulted them in the past. After all was said and done, he was sentenced to about 3 years in prison in Vietnam. And if he would have been convicted on all the charges that he faced, he might have been executed by firing squad. Eventually, though, he served his sentence and he was released in Vietnam. And after a lot of countries said they wouldn't let Gary Glitter in, he returned home to the UK. But he wasn't safe there. He was arrested shortly after arriving back in the UK after he faced a number of new allegations against him. Eventually, he was charged with 8 counts of sexual offenses against girls from the ages of 12 to 14 in the years 1977 to 1980. One of these charges alleged that he even crept into a 10-year-old girl's bed and attempted to essay her. So after a lengthy trial, he was finally caught again. He was imprisoned, but he could be released next year in 2023. I know that the movie The Joker received a lot of backlash for using Gary Glitter's song because he was compensated with royalties, even after all of these things had happened to him. And yeah, this just shows that this guy was not and is not a good dude.
Her arms were cut off. Her legs were cut off. Her ears were cut off. Her tongue was cut off.